So do you want Milind to lead into the case? With that
Sure.
little back-
Let me start sharing my screen. And while I do that, so GV, do you want to give us an overview of what we are going to learn in the next 2 weeks?
We are going to look at a number of issues that come up in manufacturing industry. Specifically, I think Shiv will speak with his experience about, first of all, this is a data science course, so question about where the data come from in the manufacturing industry. Is it really digital? How do we convert all the existing physical records that are there in manufacturing industry to digital? Those kind of issues, we have to look at it. So that will come. Certainly, we will try to introduce some of that, but we want to see the digital data that is available in manufacturing industries and use it to do some analysis of sales and revenue, similar to what we did in the FabMart, the e-commerce case that we did already. But the difference from that case leading into this case is that these products are not stocked and sold like e-commerce, but they're actually manufactured. So we're going to look at the manufacturing aspects. How do we do production planning and analysis of and scheduling of the production and the analysis of that. And, materials that go into production, basically they have costs and so on. So how do you look at the bill of materials? And then profitability analysis of different parts. And work back from there to understand the materials. How do you plan procurement of materials? What kind of materials are required, first of all, to do this production? What kind of human resources are required to do this production? So some kind of requirement analysis that we will be doing for raw materials and human resources. And we saw a little bit of some of this in the first 4 weeks, how material and people resources and material resources, how important they are in the costing and in planning and all that. So we're going to get into it in more detail in this case. And of course, as we go along doing all of this, we'll be doing this through spreadsheets. So we'll learn a little bit more about spreadsheets and how to use spreadsheets to do this kind of analysis.
So with that context, maybe we can start talking about the case that we have today. The case that we have today is about a company called Ace Gears. And Ace Gears is what is called in the automotive industry as a tier 1 supplier. The people that make the cars actually, that make and sell the cars in the automotive industry are called OEMs. And these would then be people like
OEM is original equipment manufacturer, right? OEM is.
That is correct. Original equipment manufacturer. And there is companies like, let's say, Hyundai or General Motors or Ford, companies like that. But there are a bunch of companies, as Shiv was mentioning, that actually make the sub-assemblies. And Ace Gears is one such company. And so in that context, it's called a tier 1. So Shiv, why don't you tell us a little bit about this company? What does this company do? What are some of the challenges that a company like this faces that we can use data to analyze?
Absolutely. So as Milind just mentioned, the Ace Gears is actually manufacturing gear assemblies. So basically, when you think of the concept of the gear, it is actually the way to transmit the energy that's created from one source into another place. So in specific context of the automobile, you have the engine that's creating the internal combustion engine that's creating the rotating energy, and the gear is used to actually transmit this energy to the different wheels, right? So that's why it's called a transmission, because it's transmitting the energy from the motor to the different wheels. So this company is involved in creating gear assemblies that go into this transmission, right? So that is the main business of this company, and it has to supply mostly to OEMs, but also to some tier 1 companies, which then create finished transmissions, right? So it does both of these things, and it has customers in all the parts of the country, right? So basically, it is supplying to OEMs located in the different regions, and you will see that in a bit later on in this case study. It has a number of products, right? It has a number of different types of gears, gear assemblies, and so on. And for the purpose of this case study, we are actually going to consider 10 products, just to keep it more easy to follow, that we will look in this case study. And Milind, when we talked about some of the challenges that an industry like this faces, right, is that automobile demand is highly variable, as we all know, right? So it depends on a number of things. It depends on government policies around and changes in those policies. It depends on the festive season, for example, where a lot of people tend to buy new cars and so on. It depends also on availability of parts. So right now, we are, for example, passing through a phase when electronic components are not available in the way that they used to be. So now there is a supply challenge that comes into the industry. Then, of course, there's labor. Labor or people are very important to actually run these lines, right, and create these products. And sometimes what happened in 2020 was that because of COVID, for instance, all this labor that worked in factories in this industry actually went back, right, to their native towns and villages. And that meant there was a big shortage of labor. And of course, the safety of operating the factory in the pandemic. So these are all kinds of challenges that affect this industry, right from the demand to the supply, to all of the resources that are required for this industry keeps changing over time.
So these challenges seem really, really large, and I'm very curious to see how using data, perhaps we can break them down into smaller challenges, right?
Absolutely. I think data has made a huge difference in the productivity and the cost of running operations for this industry. They were one of the pioneers to adopt technology to run their planning and manufacturing and procurement operations. So if you go way back in early 90s, Mahindra & Mahindra was one of the first companies in India to implement a full-fledged ERP system, right? SAP system. So this industry
you have to explain what is ERP system. I guess you have a slide later, maybe, which explains it.
Yes, I think there is a slide in a couple of slides. We have one that talks about ERP.
Okay. ERP is enterprise resource planning, huh?
Yes. ERP is enterprise resource planning. And we will talk a bit more in detail when we get to that point. But it's basically the way to integrate all the different planning functions of a company into one single base of data, right? Earlier, you used to have different types of data to manage different parts of the company or different functions of the company. If we go down one or two slides, there is a slide about ERP. So that actually shows you, yes, this one. So as you see here, right, earlier, all of these circles used to operate independently. So you have the finance department, which has its own accounting system. And then you had the production department, which had its own production tracking system. You had the human resource department, which had its own HR system and so on. And all of these systems are not connected. The data was not commonly held, right, in one single database. And what that meant was the data that production shows would be different from the data that sales shows or finance shows. And this used to cause a lot of confusion and a lot of error in the way we plan and execute the business. But with the coming of the ERP systems back in the 80s, and it really accelerated in the 90s and the last decade, is companies are now operating out of a single system which got integrated database. So that once you record a product as produced out in the production module, it immediately updates the costs in the costing module. It updates the inventory in the finance module. It updates the availability in the sales module, and so on. So that everyone is now working with the same set of data. So that is a bit about ERP. But as I said before, automotive industry has been a very forerunner in adopting ERP systems.
So Shiv, this picture is actually quite interesting, because in the FabMart case, we saw perhaps a simplified view where we were only talking about inventory management, planning, and finance. Okay, but clearly, what this picture tells us is that there are many departments in the company, and each one of them is doing their own bit, and all of it has to sort of gel together like a gear, right? Almost.
Yes, that's a really interesting analogy. That is very true. And if you look at the manufacturing industry and compare it to service industry or other industries, it has got a much broader set of activities, right? If you look at a trading industry or even e-commerce, it's really about procuring a product and then making it available to the customer in a very fast way, right? Whereas if you look at this industry, it's actually got to think about how do I not only procure all the components that are required to create my product, but also it has to schedule all the machines that are required to actually convert the components into a finished product. It has to make sure that the labor is available at the right place at the right time. It has to make sure that the finished product at different stages of production are tracked appropriately. And then it has to think about making sure it is distributed to the right places so that the logistics industry can then take it over and deliver it to the final point. So that's why you'll see a lot more richness in the business functions in a manufacturing industry.
Also, in an e-commerce example that Milind pointed out, the data is already digital in the digital form because you've sold it electronically, I presume. So you have a digital data right from the beginning at the origin itself, isn't it? Whereas here, presumably, some item is shipped, the shipping voucher and all. There are many physical records. I mean, things are physical, goods are physical, and a lot of records are also physical, I presume. And so somewhere this physical data has to get converted into, somebody has to make entry, right? Digital data entry to make this thing into a digital data. So can you speak about when data gets actually entered into the system, into the ERP system?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great point. And there are many points which are still paper-based in the industry, although the companies, leading companies are trying to minimize how much of physical entries there. A typical example is when your raw materials arrive into your inventory or storeroom, right? If it's a steel bars or whatever that is being bought, and so somebody has to then record that this has been received, how much has been received, is it in good quality? And a lot of times you find that this is maintained in manual records. And then later somebody enters that data into the system. Although companies are now providing point of, interfaces that people can actually key this in right at the time that they receive. Similarly, when you're actually manufacturing, the actual quantity produced is actually recorded by manufacturing execution systems that are attached to the line. But from here, it needs to then travel into the ERP system. So you'll see some data that's coming from machine to into the ERP system as well, right? So there is a number of points where there is manual information or external information that needs to be captured into the ERP system.
Okay.
Fantastic. So, Shiv, why you were mentioning that this company makes 10 products, and that, it's a very large number of products. So perhaps you can tell us what are the kind of products that this company makes?
Yes. So as we were saying, they do make a number of products, and we have considered 10 of them in this case study. What you see there is something called a gear assembly. All the products that we're talking about here are gear assemblies. So gear assembly, you can think of it as more than one gear joined together, right? And there are different types of gears. There are helical gears, there are spur gears, all these types of things that are used in a transmission. And we are considering a gear assembly which is made out of two gears. So the way this actually works, if you actually go down one slide, I think it might be easier to explain with some pictures. Just one more slide here. One more slide. Yeah. So actually, yeah, go up once. Yeah. So as you can see here on the right side, you see the gear assembly. So it's actually got two helical gears that are put together. And what that then does, as you can imagine, is actually transmitting the energy that's created in one axis into another axis, right? From vertical to horizontal or horizontal to vertical. And this gear assembly involves actually two gears. So as you can see here, this is gear assembly number 3 that's then sent to the OEM. But actually, it involves gears 3A and 3B, which are the two gears that are part of that assembly, right? Now, the company has to then make these two gears. And gears are made using a a two-step process. One is called hobbing and the other is called broaching. So hobbing is, think of it as the way that the external teeth of the gear are actually cut. And then the broaching, in a very simple way, is the internal things, like whether it be that shaft kind of thing that allowing it to be fit, etc., to be made, is the broaching process. And the whole thing starts with the blank that you see on the left. So the company procures these blanks, which look like that. And then they do the hobbing process, which cuts those teeth that is in the outer side. And then the broaching that finishes the insides. And similarly, it has to make two such gears, 3A and 3B, in a very similar way. And then they're put together into this assembly. And quality inspection is done, packaging is done, and then it's sent to the OEM, right? So that's the whole process that we are going to see. And we're going to see this from the sales end and working backward through the chain, right? Because we're going to see how much is the actual sales of these assemblies. And then we'll see, okay, to make those sales, what's the amount of gears we need to make. And then from there, we'll see how many blanks we need to buy and so on. So we are going to go from the right to the left as we proceed through the case study.
So when I hear the word gear, right, Shiv, I think of, when I change my gear in my scooter or in my car, and that this assembly is what actually enables it, is it?
Absolutely. There are different, transmission is a very complex mechanism, but you can think of it as there is a certain amount of power and torque that the engine can create, right? When you're in a standstill and you want to move forward, you need a very high level of torque. That means you need a very short gear. Think of it as a way to move your car forward with a lot of push, right? That's the torque that it gives. But as you get more, the vehicle moving, now you want to increase the speed of the vehicle, and then you are switching to longer and longer gears from the shorter gear, so that you get more revolutions on the wheels as the car or two-wheeler moves forward. So that's the whole purpose of this transmission, is it's actually helping you to switch from a state of rest to a state of increasing speeds. And that's when the horsepower kicks in, right? When you're on a high speed, then you want more horsepower. When you're on a very low speed, you want more torque. And that's what this gear assemblies enable.
And so why would I have 10 different kinds of gear assemblies? Because there are different car models or there are different motorcycle models, is it?
Yes, absolutely. So if you think about the industry itself, there is both passenger vehicles and commercial vehicles, and the company supplies to both of them. If you think of trucks and pickup trucks and so on, that's a commercial vehicle segment. And then even within the passenger vehicles, there are so many manufacturers, and most of them have proprietary transmissions, right? They make their own, or they source it from a certain company that is made for that particular model. So when you look at all these different models of transmissions, then you need a number of different gear assemblies that go into it.
So in this slide, you were mentioning that there are 3 different kinds of gear assemblies.
Yes. What we will cover in the slide is we want to illustrate an important aspect, which was a transition from Bharat Stage 4 to Bharat Stage 6 that happened on April 1st, 2020. So the Supreme Court ruled that because of the increasing pollution in the country, and the government, of course, had regulations already in place to move from BS4 to BS6, but there was a clear ruling that March 31st, 2020 was the last day that the BS4 equipped vehicles could be sold based on the court ruling. And so what you see here is that there are certain assemblies that are used in the transmissions of the BS4 types of vehicles. So the cars that were sold before March 31st, 2020 used gear assemblies that were fit for BS4 or graded for BS4. And then once the new norms kicked in on April 1st, 2020, the industry switched to BS6. And then what happened is some of the parts that were in the transmission had to be redesigned and made more stronger and more resilient to support BS6. So what happened is, of the 10 gear assemblies that we're going to discuss in this case study, there are 6 of them that can be used or that were used in both the BS4 and BS6 transmissions. The reason being that those particular gear assemblies did not get affected because of this transition. They continue to be used. But there are two parts or two assemblies that were stopped, when the BS4 ended, because those gear assemblies could only be used in the older BS4 transmissions. And there are two parts that actually were new parts that started selling just before the transition to BS6 happened. And these parts are specifically made for BS6 requirements or changes because of the BS6 requirements in the transmission. So these two parts are new parts that only start selling very close to the date of the launch of the BS6 vehicles. So you'll see all these examples in the data, because you'll see the assemblies 1 and 2, which are BS4, which you'll see that they stop their sales, or the sales stop, they drop off and then they stop well before BS6 norms kick in. And then you'll see 6 parts which continue their sales because they are not affected by the transition. And you'll see 2 assemblies that actually start the sales just before the BS6 norm.
So Shiv, sorry, Bill.
Sorry, go ahead.
This pattern where you see one type going down, another type going up, and so on is very typical in manufacturing, right? Because whenever there's a technology change or when a model is discontinued, another model is introduced, you will see these transitions, isn't it? You'll see transitions from one type to another type.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, some of this is regulatory, like from the government, but there's a lot of other changes that come because a new model is introduced or a new generation of a car is actually introduced. So if you look at a very popular car like Honda City, right, it's had 4 or 5 generations. Every 6-7 years, a new generation comes. And when you have a new generation of a car, almost everything gets changed. There's a new engine typically, there's a new transmission. So when those things happen as well, the component suppliers and the tier 1 suppliers all have to quickly adapt to that change and start making new assemblies or new parts to cater to the new model, the new model generation of the manufacturer, right? So a lot of changes like this keep happening. We're just showing in here just one change from BS4 to BS6.
And so Shiv, the thing that strikes me is that if I make too many BS4 assemblies and BS4 cars are no longer being sold, then I have a problem, no? Because I will not be able to sell those assemblies going forward. So I need to plan ahead and figure out exactly how much I want to make.
Absolutely. I think you hit on a very important point there, Milind. This is why planning is so important in this industry, right? Because there is a lead time involved in everything, right? So if a manufacturer has to start, for example, making new BS6 cars or stop making BS4 cars, then usually, let's take the example of the BS6, right? When the manufacturer starts selling new BS6 cars on April 1st, that means they have to start making the cars at least 1 or 2 months ahead, because then they have to reach the cars to the showrooms in time. And then if the manufacturer has to start a month ahead, then the assembly supplier of the assemblies that go into the transmission, they have to start probably 2 months ahead to start providing these parts so that then that can get built. And so it goes, right? If you have to provide those parts 2 months ahead, then the actual raw material, the gear blank maker, will probably have to do 3 months ahead before that. And so the planning is so important in this industry. And we call it the time-phased planning. So you have to actually look at buckets of time, whether it be months, weeks, etc. And you have to say, how much am I going to make and sell in those buckets? And therefore, what does it mean for the previous bucket for another part of my own factory or my supplier, and go backward like that. So as we get into the data, you'll see the time buckets that we use is, in this case, mostly the monthly buckets for the 2 years, and you'll see how the transitions actually affect many months ahead of the actual change happening at the end of the chain.
So, I think in the FabMart case also, we looked at a little bit of this time variability, but there we had only 15 days data, so we couldn't see too much, no?
Correct. We couldn't see any trends, in fact, there. Hopefully, we'll see more trends in this one because it's monthly and over a period, I think 2-year data we have. Let's see how it looks.
Right. So, Shiv, why don't you introduce us to some of the people in this company?
Yes, absolutely. There are we'll consider different roles as we go through the case study, just to show you all of the different departments that are involved in actually planning, scheduling, procuring, and manufacturing. Right. So the first role we'll see is the sales manager, who is responsible for planning the sales of these gear assemblies and forecasting how many we need in the future. That's Archana, and then you'll hear from Swaroop, who is a production scheduler, who has to then make sure that the machines, the hobbing, broaching, and other machines are appropriately loaded with the right kind of blanks to make the right kind of gears and assemblies. You'll also see the shop floor manager, who is responsible for the day-to-day inventory, work in progress, which means the product that are still being made on the floor of the factory, and the finished goods, who is Francis. And then you'll also see Razia, who is the purchasing manager, who has to make sure that the raw materials are procured in time, the blanks are procured so that there is no stoppage to any of the machines for want of raw materials, yet trying to make sure we have the right amount of raw materials and we don't overly stock more than what we need, because every item you stock, there's a cost to buying and stocking that. You'll also hear from Chandru, who is a finance manager, who's concerned with profitability, revenue, and other accounting related items. Because at the end of the day, the company has to make money. We have to make sure the products are profitable, cash is collected at the right time from the customers, and so on. So you'll hear from Chandru, and also we'll talk about Ashish's role, who's a human resources manager, because to run all these machines and think of the factory where there's so many hobbing machines, so many broaching machines, so many assembly lines, you need a lot of workforce, both own workforce, employees, and contract workforce that is available to run these machines, to inspect the product for quality and all of that. So workforce planning is another key element of manufacturing, and we will also meet all of these people as we go through the case study.
So GB, looks like the finance people do roughly the same activity in all companies, because in FabMart also the finance person, the CFO, had a roughly similar concerns, right? But the inventory here, that looks a little different, I think, because there it was more about sales, right? It was more about pushing things to customers, while here it is more about sourcing from suppliers.
It's a combination. It's both, I think. Yeah. There is also this interesting work in progress, which will never be there in a commerce company.
Correct. So it's a little bit of difference, but I think the finance guys are largely the same in all companies.